What if I told you that the most famous shipwreck of the East India Company era was not about water, but about land? The British galleon Grosvenor did not sink in a battle with pirates or in a giant storm. It crashed into a shore that promised salvation, but instead became a deadly trap. The crew that survived the 1782 maritime disaster found themselves drawn into a land-based thriller, where gold was a meaningless cargo and every step across the South African savannah was a step towards oblivion. Watch the video to the end to find out the true price of survival in the wild and why the few survivors envied those who perished in the waves. Are you ready for the shocking truth? The tragedy began with something incredible, an ordinary navigational error. It was noon on August 4th, 1782. The British East India Company ship Grosvenor, heavily laden with gold and Indian goods, was sailing its usual route, seemingly safe. There were 150 people on board, including the crew, passengers, and several influential British families. They were rushing home after a long voyage from India. Captain John Coxon Preston made a fatal mistake that may have cost him his life and destroyed almost the entire crew. He turned east too early. The ship was much closer to the South African coast than its outdated charts and his own arrogance suggested. The crew knew this route. They had sailed it many times, but human error, overconfidence, and the inaccuracy of old information led to terrible consequences. At around 4 a.m., in the darkness thick with fog, the watchman heard a rumbling that could not be mistaken for anything else. The ship crashed at full speed into the coastal reefs off what is now called the Wild Coast, near the mouth of the Umzimvubu River. The first impact was so strong that it immediately tore off the rudder and ripped out part of the keel. Panic swept across the deck. The cries of the crew, the moans of the women, the crash of breaking bulkheads, and the water pouring into the holds all mixed together in a cacophony. Everyone knew they were trapped, and the powerful waves relentlessly tore at the already damaged hull. The Grosvenor was stuck on underwater rocks, unable to move, and waves of incredible force crashed over the ship, quickly turning it into a pile of splinters. Locked in their cabins, the passengers fought against the elements, while the crew tried to launch at least some of the lifeboats, but one of them was instantly smashed against the hull by the waves. The morning brought no rescue, only revealing the extent of the disaster. The ship lay just 100 meters from the shore, but the waves made it impossible to reach it, and the reefs and currents made this short distance deadly dangerous. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. What do you think about the role of outdated maps in this disaster? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new investigations. Want to know a secret that will change your life? The Grosvenor was not just a ship, but part of a huge, all-powerful system, the British East India Company. It was not just a trading company. It was a state within a state, with its own army, navy, and right to govern colonies, and its ships carried not just cargo, but the economic power of the empire itself. The Grosvenor was a 20-gun galleon, specially built to transport valuable goods and protect them from French privateers. Its holds were filled with riches: Chinese porcelain, spices, precious stones, unique fabrics, but most importantly, gold and silver bullion intended to finance British military campaigns in America and Europe. The exact value of the cargo remains a matter of debate, but in the prices of the time, it was worth millions of pounds sterling, a huge sum that made every voyage of the East India Company comparable to a state mission. The official manifest mentioned 12 boxes of gold and a large quantity of jewels that were to be delivered to the royal family. The passengers were senior officers of the company, their families, and retired officials returning home with their accumulated wealth. These people represented the elite of the colonial administration, and their deaths were not only a personal tragedy, but also a loss of valuable administrative and military experience for the crown. These passengers, often arrogant and accustomed to luxury, were completely unprepared for the encounter with the primitive elements, which was one of the reasons for future tragedies on land. Also on board were soldiers and numerous servants, who made up a significant part of the crew. They were the least protected in the disaster, but oddly enough, their endurance and habit of hardship gave them a better chance of survival in future trials. The crew, consisting of experienced sailors, was confident in the indestructibility of their ship, and this confidence led to a fatal complacency when Captain Preston did not give the order to change course. The purpose of the voyage was not simply to deliver the cargo, but to arrive before the start of the storm season, which made sailing around the Cape of Good Hope extremely dangerous. It was this rush, with this desire to shorten the route and save a few days, that caused the captain to sail too close to the coast, believing he was far out at sea. But knowledge of the area was only half the battle. Ready to find out how the survivors of the sea faced an unprecedented enemy on land? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret. By a miracle, an incredible effort, after several hours of desperate struggle with the waves, 135 people managed to reach the shore. This landing was not an organized rescue, but a chaotic escape from a sinking ship, where everyone saved themselves, using any board or debris to swim to the invisible shore. The water was freezing, and the current carried them out to sea, but the proximity of land gave them one last chance. Captain Preston, despite his navigational error, organized the launch of the last surviving boats and rafts, risking his life but remaining on board until the hull began to break apart. He was among the last to leave the ship, showing that professional honor was more important to him than his own safety. They used a ship's rope, which they managed to secure to the shore, to cross, but the rope was too thin to withstand the weight of everyone. The survivors found themselves on a narrow sandbar, separated from the mainland by raging waves and tidal channels. One of the most ingenious but desperate improvisations was a raft made from door frames and deck debris. On it, they managed to transport women, the elderly, and several wounded to solid ground. Many of them, including officers and several passengers, were able to grab small bags with personal belongings, clothes, and, most importantly, weapons and gunpowder. Everyone hoped that they would be able to return to the wreckage and salvage at least part of the cargo. But on that beach, among the wet debris, they realized that the golden jewels for which they had sailed for 6 months were now completely useless cargo, incapable of buying a sip of water or a piece of bread. Their survival depended on one thing: the ability to coordinate, not to panic, and to decide on further actions. The beach was lifeless and deserted, and their only hope was to head north to the Dutch settlements in the Cape Colony. This landing was not a rescue, but the beginning of a new, much more painful ordeal. A small group of sailors, demonstrating remarkable resilience, managed to save compasses, several axes, and sailcloth, which they used to create temporary shelters from the scorching sun. Their practicality, contrasting with the confusion of the passengers, determined the further fate of the entire group. This story is a vivid example of how resourcefulness can turn trash into a valuable resource. Like this video if you believe that ingenuity is more important than wealth. What you are about to learn will change your perception of survival. The survivors were faced with the most important and fateful question: where to go? They were about 250 miles from the nearest European settlement, a Dutch trading post. Captain Preston, relying on his old maps and vague ideas about the coastline, decided to head north to Cape Town, believing it to be the shortest route. This choice was based not only on logistics, but also on psychology. The captain did not want to split up the group, hoping to maintain some semblance of discipline and hierarchy, which was extremely important for the passengers. Representatives of the British elite, who were not accustomed to obeying anyone but their superiors. However, this decision proved disastrous, as their route lay through the wildest and most uninhabited part of the coast, populated only by warlike tribes. The very next day after the disaster, the first split occurred. Several sailors and servants, knowing about the harsh conditions of the coast and the inaccuracy of the maps, suggested staying at the crash site and waiting for help, or building small rafts to sail along the coast. However, Captain Preston rejected this idea, believing that sitting and waiting was cowardly and that building rafts would take too long. He convinced most of the group that an organized march along the shore, maintaining discipline, would lead them to safety. This detachment consisted of 103 people, all women and children, officers, and most of the passengers. They took with them the few things they could salvage: 20 muskets, some hardtack, a few pots, and 12 bottles of wine. They believed that weapons would guarantee their safety in this wild land. The remaining 32 people, mostly sailors and Indian servants, decided to move in a less familiar, but as they believed, safer direction, south toward the settlements they had heard about from Dutch sailors. These people, accustomed to manual labor, immediately set about searching for food, proving their great adaptability. But even the most cunning trail is useless if the pursuers have no water. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Apaches turned the main source of life in the desert into a deadly weapon. The march north turned into an exhausting ordeal that quickly revealed fatal differences between people. Preston's group, dominated by passengers unaccustomed to physical exertion, moved slowly and inefficiently. Their discipline, based on a strict hierarchy, was good on the ship but completely useless in the savannah. They quickly exhausted their food supplies as they did not know how to hunt or fish. The passengers, accustomed to being served, expected food to appear by itself or to be obtained by the sailors, but the latter were busy with security and navigation. Soon their entire diet was reduced to the rare shells and roots they found in the coastal zone, which quickly weakened the most frail. The climate became their worst enemy. During the day, the scorching African sun caused severe dehydration, and at night the temperature dropped sharply, causing hypothermia. Their European clothing, warm and elegant, proved completely unsuitable for the tropical coast. With each passing day, the march became more difficult. The survivors were forced to cross raging rivers, impenetrable thickets, and rocky cliffs. Their European shoes and boots quickly wore out, leaving their feet wounded, which made every step painful and slowed down the entire group. Their only hope was their weapons. They protected them from attacks by wild animals and allowed them to hunt small game. But gunpowder was running out, and every shot counted. They did not know that what awaited them ahead was not salvation, but complete loss of hope in the final disintegration of the group. When the Apaches did decide to engage in battle, they chose the ideal conditions for it. On the 16th day of their journey, Preston's group encountered the first inhabitants of these lands, members of the Xhosa tribe. This was the Europeans' first contact with the local population after the crash, and it proved to be fateful. The tribe, numbering about 200 people, greeted the weakened and exhausted Englishmen with wary curiosity. It was not a hostile encounter, but a kind of test. The tribal chiefs showed no aggression, but made it clear that they did not welcome the strangers and considered them a threat. Captain Preston, despite his weakened state, attempted to establish trade relations. He offered buttons from his uniform and small metal objects in exchange for food, but they were much more interested in copper and iron, which were in short supply. The passengers, still relying on their high society status, were arrogant and demanded rather than asked, which turned the local population against them. The most terrible decision was made by Captain Preston, who was faced with a choice between supplies and life. To speed up the march and free himself from ballast, he ordered several wounded and the weakest passengers to be left on shore, along with all unnecessary equipment, including boxes of dishes and furniture. He hoped that the Maori would help them. This decision, based on calculation and cold-bloodedness, had disastrous moral consequences. Seeing that the captain was willing to abandon his own people, the members of the group lost what little respect they had left for him and for discipline. From that moment on, everyone began to think only of themselves and the group began to fall apart. One of the passengers, William Hubberley, decided to stay with those who had been abandoned, demonstrating an act of humanity that contrasted sharply with the captain's cruelty. His action became a symbol of how even in the most dire circumstances, people are capable of compassion. How many people today do you think would be able to make a candle with their own hands? The success of the Apache military operations would have been impossible without a unique logistics system. Left without food and moral support, the survivors completely lost all sense of organization. The march turned into a chaotic retreat, with everyone moving at their own pace. Women and children were left behind, becoming easy prey for disease and wild animals. Captain Preston, weakened by hunger and perhaps guilt over the disaster, died on the 25th day after the shipwreck. His death marked the end of organized rescue efforts. With his passing, the last vestige of formal authority disappeared, and the group finally split into small, isolated groups, each fighting for itself. The largest group, about 30 people, was led by Second Officer Thomas Sevens. He was more pragmatic and focused on finding food and water, but even his efforts were not enough to save everyone. He established a harsh but fair dictatorship where all decisions were made for the sake of the group's survival, not for the sake of preserving status. The passengers, including the influential Capper family, refused to obey Sevens and decided to follow their own route, convinced that their social status would somehow protect them. They believed that their European education and knowledge of geography were more important than the ability to find food. Their fate turned out to be the most tragic. The only woman who made it to Cape Town was Mrs. Frances Duxham, a young maid who was not burdened by status and possessed incredible physical endurance. She traveled with the Sevens group, who supported each other despite the harsh conditions. Her survival proved that there is no place for privilege in the wild. Raiding, or raids, were the basis of Apache military activity. Thomas Sevens' group, numbering about 25 people, was the only one destined to travel nearly 400 miles to safety. Their success was based on a complete rejection of the old hierarchy and the adoption of harsh laws of survival. They divided the remaining weapons and food among themselves, establishing strict consumption norms. Everyone in the group had to perform their function. Some hunted, some searched for water, and some followed tracks. This system, based on equality and interdependence, proved to be much more effective than a strict chain of command. Their food was meager, but sufficient to maintain their strength. They learned to fish in coastal waters, collect wild bird eggs, and hunt small rodents and antelopes. Sevens, himself an experienced hunter, developed primitive traps and snares that allowed them to obtain food without wasting gunpowder. Sevens and his group deliberately avoided conflicts with local tribes, preferring to bypass large settlements or offer symbolic gifts to avoid aggression. They understood that the weapons in their hands were not a means of defense, but a cause of conflict, and that the best tactic was to be inconspicuous. On the 60th day of their march, when their strength was already running out, they encountered Dutch hunters. These were the first Europeans they had seen since the disaster. The hunters gave them first aid, shared their food, and sent a messenger to the nearest fort. Of the 135 people who came ashore, only 18 Europeans and 23 Indian servants and sailors reached the Dutch settlements. The rest died in the savannah from hunger, thirst, disease, or were consumed by wildlife. On paper, the American cavalry had an overwhelming advantage over the Apaches. Strangely enough, the highest percentage of survivors was among the Indian servants and sailors. These were people accustomed to living in conditions of scarcity, physical labor, and a harsh climate. Many of them, as we remember, had initially separated from Preston's main group, following their own route or simply remaining at the crash site. It was those who refused to follow the arrogant captain who had the best chance of survival. Their modesty and ability to be content with little proved to be much more valuable than all the European knowledge. They did not strive for an organized march, but instead lived in small, isolated groups, using the skills they had acquired in their homeland. They knew how to filter water, how to cook food from herbs and roots, and how to build temporary shelters. In this respect, they were much more adapted to the wild. About 20 Indian servants decided to settle among the local tribes and assimilate with them. They exchanged their meager possessions for shelter and protection, and their knowledge of English and European customs made them valuable sources of information for the Xhosa. These people consciously rejected the civilization that had abandoned them and chose to live in harmony with nature. Their fate remained unknown for a long time, and they were listed in official reports as missing. However, according to later expeditions, many of them lived among the Xhosa until old age, leaving behind descendants who spoke broken English and remembered stories about the sunken ship. This was a conscious choice in favor of survival rather than an attempt to return to the colonial system, where they were merely servants. The Apache victories were achieved not only through tactics and endurance, but also through masterful psychological warfare. The Grosvenor disaster did not simply become a page in history, it spawned a legend that lives on to this day and caused a veritable gold rush in South Africa. The legend of untold treasures lying at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Umsimvubu has stirred the minds of adventurers and treasure hunters for decades. Official reports mentioning 12 chests of gold led to at least 15 major treasure expeditions being organized in the 19th and 20th centuries. The first expedition was organized as early as 1790 by the government of the Cape Colony. It was a land expedition, and its goal was not so much to find gold as to rescue the survivors. This mission was only able to find a few wreckage and 2 survivors who lived among the tribes, but the legend of the treasure only grew stronger. The most ambitious attempts to recover the treasure were made in the 1880s and 1930s. Engineers built complex systems of tunnels and dams in an attempt to divert water from the wreck site. As a result of these efforts, cannons, anchors, coins, and porcelain were found, but the mythical 12 chests were never discovered. Today, the site of the Grosvenor's wreck is a South African National Heritage Site. It is located in a protected area, and any search operations are strictly regulated. But even now, more than 240 years later, divers and treasure hunters continue to dream of the gold that was swallowed up by the wild coast. This is a story of how greed and the pursuit of wealth remain unshakable, despite tragedy. We see that the story of the Grosvenor is not just a chronicle of a maritime disaster. It is a profound and somber exploration of human nature in the face of utter ruin. It shows how European hierarchy, wealth, and education proved useless in the face of hunger in the wilderness. It was not the rich or the noble who survived, but those who were resilient, pragmatic, and willing to give up their privileges. The experience of the survivors is a harsh lesson that civilization and its rules disappear when food and water disappear. They lost because they tried to impose their rules on the wild land, and those who accepted the rules of that land won. This is a cautionary tale that proves that in the long run, it is not the strongest who survive, but the most adaptable. Which of the Apache tactics do you find most ingenious, and why? Was it the technique of disappearing on the rocks, or the masterful use of water as a weapon? Which moment in the story of the Grosvenor shocked you the most? The captain's fatal mistake or the moral collapse of the group on shore? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into historical dramas and adventures.